I'm having the executive game.
You know, your father and me started that game over 30 years ago.
They call it the executive game. Say those words out loud. The executive game. It sounds like something that happens in a penthouse suite. Cigars that cost more than your car payment, crystal tumblers, maybe a guy in a tuxedo dealing cards on green felt while Sinatra croons in the next room. Now picture this, a roadside motel off Route 17 in New Jersey, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a guy in a tracksuit screaming about provolone cheese, while another man stomps cold cuts into the carpet. Someone's asleep on the couch.
7 card.
Was that Frank Sinatra Jr. in there?
Yeah. It's a friend of my uncle's. He flies in.
Wow, this really is an executive game.
The biggest celebrity in the room is Frank Sinatra Jr. That gap between what the name promises and what the screen actually shows you might be the single most brilliant visual joke in the entire run of The Sopranos. And it's telling you everything about the show's real thesis. For anyone who needs a refresher, the executive game is a recurring element across The Sopranos. It's a high-stakes, invite-only poker game run by Tony Soprano's crew. In the mythology of the show, this game has history.
You fucking believe it? We now run the executive game. Well, my old man and Uncle Junior had it.
Junior and Johnny Boy Soprano built it decades earlier. Back in the 60s, the real Frank Sinatra might have walked through the door. Back then, gambling was illegal in New Jersey. No Atlantic City casinos, no legal card rooms. So if you wanted high-stakes action, you came to guys like the Sopranos. The mob was the only game in town. But that was then. By the time we see the executive game on screen, in the early 2000s, the world has changed. Casinos are legal. Atlantic City is a short drive away. Any high roller with money to burn can walk into a legitimate casino, get comped a suite, and play at tables with better odds and better food.
Davey, this isn't a game for you.
So what's left? What kind of person still shows up to an illegal mob poker game in a New Jersey motel room in the year 2001? The answer tells you everything. The players we see aren't titans of industry. They're not movie stars. They're a surgeon with a gambling problem.
So there's a lot of money in sporting goods, eh?
Yeah, Frank, but I tell you...
The owner of a failing sporting goods store. A few of Tony's own crew members.
You want in a real game, I'll hook you up. David Lee Roth.
And, if they're lucky, maybe a faded celebrity. David Lee Roth or Frank Sinatra's kid. That's the executive game. And the show knows exactly how pathetic it is. Let's talk about the room itself, because every detail is a choice. The game takes place in a motel that Tony's crew acquired a stake in through a deal with Hasidic Jewish businessmen, 25% ownership, which means the room is free, the staff looks the other way, and Paulie Walnuts has a local cop on the payroll who patrols the area. His only instructions are basically, don't let anyone complain and no gunshots. That's the infrastructure.
Your friends, players or no, they don't fuck with the tourists and the hotel guests. Keep the noise down and no gunshots or we gotta take the call.
A dirty cop, a comped motel room, and a prayer that nobody fires a weapon. Now, fans have debated for years why Tony doesn't spring for something nicer. A suite at a real hotel, a private room at a restaurant, hell, even a better motel. And the surface level answers all make sense. It's free. They have control over the staff. A legitimate hotel would never tolerate Silvio Dante screaming at 3 in the morning while hurling deli meat across the room. You can't exactly stomp provolone into the carpet at the Waldorf Astoria and expect to come back next week. But here's where it gets interesting. The show isn't just being practical, it's making an argument, because there's a scene, easy to miss, where Paulie meets his cop contact in a diner and pays him off before the game. And the cop talks about it like he's providing security for a major criminal operation. The gravity in his voice, the seriousness of the exchange. You'd think they were planning a heist.
Not finished counting, but it's up there.
But we know what actually happens in that room. A dentist loses his shirt. Johnny Sack falls asleep on the couch. Christopher makes sandwiches. The gap between how these men talk about themselves and how they actually live, that's the show. That is The Sopranos. To understand what the executive game is really doing, you have to understand what it's responding to. The Godfather. Specifically, the vision of organized crime that Coppola built and that American culture swallowed whole. In The Godfather, the mob is operatic. It's Brando in a tuxedo. It's rooms full of powerful men making history. The violence is terrible, but it's also grand. There's a majesty to it that the audience can't help but admire. The Sopranos looked at that myth and said, no. David Chase has talked about this openly. The show was designed from the ground up as a corrective, not a celebration of the mob, a dissection of it. And the executive game is one of the sharpest instruments in that dissection. Think about it. In The Godfather, you have Sinatra, the real deal, or at least his fictional stand-in, orbiting the Corleone family. In The Sopranos, you get Sinatra Jr., not the legend, the legacy act, the guy who inherited the name, but not the era. In Casino, you have Las Vegas, a city built on mob money, gleaming and dangerous. In The Sopranos, you have a motel room in Lodi, New Jersey. In Godfather 2, the mob controls Havana. In The Sopranos, they control 25% of a motel they got from a real estate deal.
Someplace you got here.
Yeah, regular Taj Mahal.
The show is constantly holding up a mirror and saying, this is what's left. This is what this thing of ours actually looks like in the year 2001. Not an empire, a card game in a room that smells like feet.
I'm having the executive game.
You know, your father and me started that game over 30 years ago.
And the name, Executive Game, is the final twist of the knife. It's branding, it's marketing. Give it a fancy title to make the yokels feel important. It's the same instinct that makes Tony call himself a captain of industry or a waste management consultant.
What line of work are you in?
Waste management consultant.
The language is always aspirational. The reality never is. And then
I'd let you get back in the game.
there's Fech Lana. And this is the part that really seals the argument.
When you and my kid brother stuck up Fech Lana's card game?
When Fech, an old school mobster freshly released from prison, briefly takes over running the executive game, something shifts.
So, we're at the Peppermint Lounge, but in walks these two stewardesses.
Suddenly, the game has David Lee Roth at the table, Lawrence Taylor, actual celebrities. The energy is different. The room might still be a dump, but the game has a charge to it.
Fech was here.
You ruled against Fech? He's an important man.
And what does Tony do? He shuts it down. He pushes Fech out. Not because Fech was running the game badly. If anything, Fech was running it better.
Tommy Peter's Guare, when I was coming up, she had the long legs.
He had the charisma, the old school magnetism to pull in real players. But that's exactly the problem. Fech is a reminder of what the game used to be, and by extension, what the mob used to be. His competence is a threat, because if you put a guy like Fech next to a guy like Tony, the decline becomes impossible to ignore. Tony doesn't want a better executive game. He wants the one he can control, even if it's embarrassing.
So, what's the game?
Even if half the players at the table are his own employees. That's the tragedy of the whole show, compressed into a single plot point. These men would rather rule a junkyard than share a kingdom. So here's the real insight, the one the show keeps circling but never quite says out loud. The executive game isn't a failure of production design. It's not a mistake. It's not the writers being lazy. It's a thesis statement. Every time Junior or Tony or anyone else reminisces about the old days, when the game was legendary, when real players showed up, when it meant something, they're doing what every character on The Sopranos does constantly.
Fech Lana. He had this Saturday night card game.
They're mythologizing a past that may not have been as golden as they remember. They're using nostalgia as a shield against the present. Because the present is a motel room. The present is provolone on the floor. The present is paying off a beat cop so nobody complains about the noise. And the genius of the show is that it never tells you this directly. It just shows you the room. It lets the contrast between the name and the reality do all the work. You hear executive game and you see a dump. And in that gap lives the entire theme of The Sopranos. That the American mob, and maybe America itself, is a story about people who can't stop narrating their own greatness while everything around them crumbles. That motel room is a mirror, and nobody in it wants to look. The next time you rewatch The Sopranos, pay attention to the rooms, not just the executive game, all of them. The Bing, the back of Satrial's, Junior's house. Notice how small everything is, how ordinary, how far from the myth. Because that's the show's secret weapon. It doesn't argue with The Godfather, it just turns on the lights. If this video changed how you see the executive game, or if you've got a detail I missed, drop it in the comments. I want to know, what's the smallest visual detail in The Sopranos that says the most? And if this is your first time here, subscribe. We break down the details that make great TV actually great.